Latin America, and we had obviously some excellent speakers. This is going to be the view from China, and we have 4 panelists, a little bit more. I will just briefly cite their bios and the topics they will address, and then we'll turn it over and get started. To my immediate left is Professor Shuxue Zhang, who has flown in from Beijing. He is the Deputy Director of the Institute of Latin American Studies of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And as I used to live in China, I can say without any hesitation that the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, or CAS, is the premier think tank in China. Professor Zhang is the recipient of numerous fellowships and has had experience in the United States. He's lectured at the University of Wyoming, a state which I have, coming from New York, I have never been to, so we'll talk about that later. The University of California at Los Angeles and the University of Southern California. In addition to numerous book chapters, articles, and papers on Latin America, he has authored 2 books, Latin American Development Models and Financial Globalization in Latin America. He's also the translator of many publications from English to Chinese, including the book Modern Latin America by Thomas Skidmore and Peter Smith. And Professor Zhang will give the overview of Chinese interests in Latin America and sort of set the table for us. Our second speaker, all the way down, raise your hand, yes, Professor Professor Lanxin Xiang, is currently Professor of International History and Politics at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. He has been awarded a number of fellowships and honors, including the 3rd Henry Kissinger Chair of Foreign Policy and International Relations at the John Kluge Center for Scholars at the Library of Congress. He's authored many books, including Strategic Partnership, the EU and China, and the Ideological Context of the U.S.-China Relationship. He has his PhD from SAIS, so it's only fitting that he be here today. And although I think born and raised in China, he has a bit of a Baltimore accent. So I'll excuse him. Oh, well, SAIS is in D.C., so he's Washington accent. Okay, and he's going to, his topic is very interesting, China's presence in the Western Hemisphere, a critical view. What he means by that, I have no idea, but we will find out. Our third speaker is Professor He Li. Professor Li is currently Professor of Political Science at Merrimack College in Massachusetts. He's written numerous publications, including 2 books, From Revolution to Reform, a comparative study of China and Mexico, and Sino-Latin American economic relations. He's got his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, and he will focus on the China-Taiwan rivalry in Latin America, which is a topic of acute interest to both sides, as well as the United States. Batting cleanup today is Dr. Cynthia Watson, and I urge you not to go to sleep, just because she's the last speaker of the day. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But first, her many accomplishments. Dr. Watson is director of the electives program and was associate dean at the National War College from 1997 through 2002. She is a member of the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations and of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. She currently serves on the editorial board of Third World Quarterly, and she is Spanish certified for recording for the blind and dyslexic. She was particularly active in 2006, writing 3 books, and another one's coming out in 2007. They dealt with the U.S. military education and national security. She received her PhD from Notre Dame, and she will speak on, which is why you should all pay attention, what all this means for the United States in terms of national security and national interests. China's presence in Latin America. So without further ado, first off, direct from Beijing, we are so fortunate to have him, Professor Zhang.
Okay, thank you, Mark. As you know, in China, in the past, international studies tend to focus on U.S., Japan, and Europe. They pay less attention to Latin America or even Africa in the past. But in the past several years, people seem to have more interest in Latin America and even Africa. So I'm quite happy that I'm how would you say, my position has been raised by this kind of great interest.
That's right.
And in the past several years, I've been invited to take part in conferences or give lectures on this topic to Argentina, Chile, Miami, London. And the year before last year, I was invited to take part in a conference in Miami and on the same topic. And after my speech, I was surrounded by many reporters, cameras, and the people asking questions. And on the second day, my photo was on the pages of the Miami Herald, and even bigger than Jeb Bush. So, so I don't know why people everywhere are so interested in this kind of topic. And I also ask this question. So for me, I would say that so Latin America is important for China in the following three ways. Politically, we need these countries to fight against the so-called hegemonism or the U.S. imperialism, to build a new world order or a harmonious world. Harmonious world is a new term proposed by the Chinese President Hu Jintao. And also, as you know, one country has one vote in the UN system, so we need their support in several ways. And economically speaking, the region is so rich in resources. China needs everything, and they have everything. And also, Latin America has a big market size, so we can sell all kinds of things to them. And finally, we are still waiting to see the final resolution of the Taiwan issue. Taiwan has 25 countries which have the so-called diplomatic relations with quotation marks with Taiwan, and 12 of them are found in America. And in China, when we say Latin America, we include Central America and the Caribbean. Okay, so because of this Taiwan issue, we need to pay more attention to Latin America. And for the time being, we can see that the bilateral relations between our two sides are very good. And we have 21 countries which have diplomatic relations with PRC. And in the past 10 years, so many high-level officials from Latin America have been to Beijing. And Chinese leaders have visited 19 countries in Latin America. So we have 21 countries which have diplomatic relations, but only 2 of the tiny Caribbean islands that we have never visited. And the Chinese Communist Party have relations with most of the political parties, even on the right or on the left. And we have the so-called strategic partnership with a couple of Latin American countries like Brazil, Mexico, and so on. And we have FTA with Chile. Chile is a very nice girl. And Chile is the first country first South American country to have diplomatic relations with China. And Chile is a nice girl which has more than 20 FTAs with all over the world. And China is one of the nice boys. And Chile is the first Latin American country that concluded the WTO treaty with China. So Chile has several firsts, okay. And so far, 13 countries from America have granted China the so-called market economy status. And there is a booming bilateral trade. And I got the number 2006 last night, soon after I put down my baggage in the hotel. And from here, you can see these big increase of numbers from 2005 to 2006, $20 billion growth, very impressive. And the China's major trade partners in 2006 are Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Venezuela, Peru, and Panama. And Brazil is the biggest. Now, China always enjoys a big trade surplus. As far as the direct investment is concerned, it is difficult for me to get the new numbers. The 2005 is the number I can get. The total stock of Chinese investment abroad was 57.2 billion, and of which about 20 of them was in Latin America. Now, just now, several panelists mentioned the numbers, Chinese investment of 100 billion US dollars. I hope this workshop will serve as a milestone in the future that no one in the West will repeat these mistakes, ground mistakes, okay? So President Hu Jintao of China did mention 100 billion US dollars, but he was not saying that Chinese investment. He was saying Chinese trade with Latin America will be 100 billion US dollars. And I want to show you the official website of the Chinese ministry about Hu Jintao's speech, but this computer not made from China. does not show Chinese. Does not show Chinese. Okay. So I suggest that from this conference, the Wilson Center will install the Chinese language software on any computers. Okay. Yeah. So this is Hu Jintao's speech. So I want Mark to translate, not me translate. Mark will translate, but it cannot show Chinese. But you can see that. Okay. So this is not Chinese investment in America. This is a bilateral trade. Okay. So from now on, no one in this conference room, no one in the U.S., no one in Argentina will repeat this mistake.
So he said 100 billion within 10 years, two-way trade.
By 2010.
By 2010. Okay.
By 2000, and just now I mentioned that now 2006 it was already 70 billion. So by 2010 we can reach that goal, 100 billion US dollars of bilateral trade. Now, everyone is asking the question: China is an angel or a devil? And the topic of our conference is enter the dragon. And as you know, in Chinese culture, dragon is a nice animal. Dragon is a fortunate animal. It's a lucky animal. Whenever it goes, it will bring nice things, luck, good fortune to the place. So that's why in the past 4 years, the economy of Latin America has been growing so fast. In 2006, it was 5.3%. So because of the dragon, it's my opinion. Okay. Why? So you sell raw materials, and China buys raw materials. Because of our huge imports, the prices has been rising so fast. So that is beneficial to Latin America. And on the one hand, the prices of raw material is rising. On the other hand, we sell cheap manufactured goods. And as you know, Rob Prebisch, the well-known Argentine economist, has a famous theory. For the developing countries, the terms of trade is always going down and down, worse and worse. But because of the Chinese effect, because of the China effect, this theory is no longer valid. The terms of trade is becoming better and better for Latin America. That's the China effect. And we offer a big market. If everyone consumes 1 cup of coffee from Brazil, then that will be 1.3 billion cups. Of course, not everyone can have the money to consume 1 cup of coffee every day. But anyway, China's market is quite big. Of course, we should say that there is a competition. And some enterprises, the weak enterprises, are just seriously hit by our cheap exports. But it is very difficult to quantify the impact. And my colleague mentioned that you calculated some losses to China. You blame everything bad on China. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce asked its counterparts of Mexico to offer some numbers. Tell me some exact numbers. How much Chinese exports has caused damage to Mexico? You have to offer these numbers like before China's exports, what kind of production output, and how many workers were employed, and after we sell the things, and what's the difference. But the Mexican side cannot offer these numbers. So it's a kind of exaggeration. So I hope after the conference we can discuss these questions through email. Tell me, quantify, exact numbers. You cannot simply, by imagination, blame everything on China. Okay? And now, so Mark asked me to say a few words on China's relations with more specific countries. And in the following several minutes, I'm going to say a few words about China's relations with Brazil, Venezuela, Cuba, and some other countries. Now, relations with Brazil, I think, is quite good, and we have a so-called strategic partnership, and you gave us the so-called market economy status, but as far as I know, some of the officials in the government said that no. So that's the mistake made by Lula. I don't know if it is true or not. And Brazil gave us support to join the IDB, support China to become an observer in the OAS. Now we also jointly launched 2 satellites in 1999 and 2003, and 3 more are in the process of making. But Brazil was quite unhappy about China's attitudes towards your efforts to become the permanent membership. But here, I would like to tell you that China can support Brazil, but Brazil stood alongside with Japan, and Japan has never recognized its war crimes. So China will not support Japan for its efforts to become the permanent membership. Okay, but still China, Brazil practices anti-dumping against the Chinese exports. So that's the big problem. Okay, and that's Brazil. And for Mexico, as far as I know, many Chinese scholars believed that the New World was not discovered by Columbus, but by the Chinese sailor Zheng He, 70 years earlier than Columbus. And Mexico was the first place Zheng He, the Chinese sailor Zheng He, landed. Okay, so we have had long relations with Mexico. But Mexico was the last country around the globe to conclude the WTO agreement with China. Okay, so China was quite unhappy about that, even after the U.S. And a strategic partnership set up in December 2003. But for the time being, so far, so Mexico has no recognition of China's market economy status. And also Mexico was the first country in America to practice anti-dumping taxes against China. Once 1,100% for our shoes. That means no exports for Chinese goods. And also Mexico claims that China is hurting its economy in the following way: flood of cheap exports and FDI diverted away from its maquiladora. And but as I said just now, that Mexico cannot offer concrete evidence to prove this kind of accusation. And also, we have different calculations of the trade balance as a deficit. And the Mexican side has the deficit, which is much, much bigger than ours. But of course, we have to see that China's surplus increased from 1.6 billion in 2003 to 6 billion in 2006. And that's also the fact.
Trade surplus with Mexico.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And last week, my institute organized a seminar together with the embassy of Mexico in Beijing to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between our two countries. And at the conference, I asked some officials from the embassy, what can you sell to China? China sent a delegation to Brazil to buy 100 airplanes, 100 airplanes. So Mexico, what can China buy? And one of the Mexican officials did not answer my question, just saying that you need to open your market. You need to lower the quarantine standards to buy more Mexican agricultural goods. So China needs oil. We can buy more oil from Mexico, but Mexico wants to sell its oil only to the U.S. And it is said that the U.S. does not allow Mexico to sell oil to China. So China can only buy Corona beer or other kinds of things. So what else can China buy from Mexico? And some Chinese scholars, including myself, suggest that Mexico and China should sign an FTA, free trade agreement. And some of the officials in my institute, as a seminar last week, they said, no, we cannot sign the free trade with China. Even today, so without the FTA, our market is flooded with Chinese goods. And after the FTA, then everything will be China made. And that's the Mexican concern. But Mexico can sign a free trade agreement with the USA. Why not with China? Of course, many Chinese scholars also say that China should make more direct investment and upgrade our export structure to sell less shoes, more computers. Now, relations with Venezuela. And we have a strategic partnership of common development. Chavez has visited China 4 times. Also, Chavez has read many books by Mao Zedong.
Oh, goody for him.
Yeah.
Chinese students are reading many books.
And during his visit, we two signed agreement of cooperation in energy, telecommunication, and infrastructures, agriculture, tourism, education, etc. And also, there's a possibility of cooperation in areas of railway construction, shipbuilding, oil machinery, and high tech. And China supported Venezuela in its bid to become as a UN Security Council member. And Venezuela supports China on the WTO membership, the Taiwan issue, the human rights issue, and so on. And when he was in Beijing in August 2006, President Hu Jintao of China suggested that 4 areas of further cooperation: increase the high-level exchanges to widen strategic consensus, deepen mutual beneficial economic cooperation, promote people-to-people exchanges, strengthen cooperation on the international stage, like UN, WTO, OAS. Now, some people saying that China should pay attention to the so-called China card. I don't know whether it is true or not. Now, finally, let me say a few words about China's relations with Cuba. And Cuba is the first country in the Western Hemisphere to have diplomatic relations with China. And Castro visited China twice. And our President Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao visited Cuba several times. And China supports Cuba in its struggle against imperialism and external interference. Now, Cuba supports China on such issues as human rights, national unification, Tibet, etc. And in the economic fields, we have cooperations in mining, agriculture, culture, tourism, education, science, and technology. And military cooperation resumed in December 1984 when China sent a military attaché to its embassy in Havana. And on the whole, economic cooperation between our two sides has been developing quite rapidly in the past several years. And the bilateral trade increased from $400 million in 2001 to almost $18 billion in 2006. Now, last April, your senior official Thomas Shannon went to Beijing. In human history, that's the first time a senior U.S. official went to Beijing to talk about China's relations with Latin America. That's the first time. And one day, the minister of your embassy invited 6 Chinese guests, and I was one of them, to have dinner with Thomas Shannon. And I asked the question, please tell me why the U.S. is so interested in China's relations with Latin America. And Thomas Shannon said that, one, in the past, many American people have bad memory of China's export of revolution. Secondly, look at today's Latin America. Morales, Chavez, Bachelet, all kinds of left leaders. So there's a rise of the left. So we are concerned about China's position towards these left governments. Okay, that's Thomas Shannon's answer. And my answer is this. The U.S. concern is unnecessary. First, China's relations with Latin America are not targeted towards any third country. Secondly, South-South cooperation. China's relations with Latin America is South-South cooperation. So South-South cooperation will benefit world peace and development. And third, since the past decade, so Latin America has been opening to its door to everywhere, to Korea, to Japan, to everybody. The beautiful girl of Latin America is over there. So the handsome boy of China is one of the boys which can court the beautiful girl. So why not China? Okay. Now, finally, the future of Sino-Latin American relations. Deng Xiaoping said that people are saying 21st century is the Pacific era, and I firmly believe that at that time there will be also a Latin American era, and I hope the Pacific era, Atlantic era, and the Latin American era appear at the same time. And he also said that China's policy is to develop and maintain good relations with Latin American countries and make Sino-Latin American relations a model of South-South cooperation. Okay, so that's the future of. And just now, somebody asked, so what's the future 10 years later? So that's the future. China's relations with Latin America will be the model of South-South cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. I think already there are some questions. So stay around. Professor Zhang.
I must express thanks for Wilson Center and for Riordan to invite me here. I'm not a typical Latin American expert, but I'm working more on China's global policies. Therefore, I offer what Mark says, you don't understand what I said, critical view, which means I'm not necessarily criticize either side, but I'm simply saying, as a Chinese living abroad, I can have I have the perspective with distance. In other words, I can look at these issues from the other side perspective as well, not presenting the official argument about China-Latin American relations. Now, first of all, I must say I agree totally with my Latin American colleagues who said there is knowledge deficit, very serious knowledge deficit between Latin America and China. That Brazilian colleague says the Brazilians don't really understand China at all. I would argue there is also a severe problem on China's side. The Spanish-speaking Latin American experts are very few, and the cultural understanding is still at a very superficial level. My own understanding when growing up in China of Latin America through those novels by Giorgio Amato and so on, we still stay at that stage. And the serious Latin American study program was started in the mid-60s. And the government invests very little in Spanish language training and the cultural studies. And my understanding is the first serious book of Latin American history was published in the 90s, especially the Cambridge History of Latin America. So for Chinese policy elite, Latin America is almost unknown land until recently, which is quite different between China relationship between China and Africa, because China knew Africa. They are very active in the 60s and the 70s. So I think the relationship between Latin America and China develops too fast, in my view, in the past few years, that both sides are still struggling to figure out what's going on, what's the significance of this very intense relationship. Now, I don't think economics and trade can explain China's the relationship with Latin America. I prefer to take a broad view, especially a geopolitical view, on this relationship. I think this is it is the broad vision of China that laid the foundation of the recent development. Now, there are several things I think is important. One is China and Latin America more or less share the view of global governance. That is, we need a multipolar international system. We need to pursue a multilateral diplomacy in international affairs. Now, that's very important for China, because China was only recently converted to multilateralism. They always support multipolar system, just as the French invent that term. Now, but multilateralism for China, or for Chinese foreign policy elite, is a new subject. Okay. If you recall, during the Cold War, China's reputation is known as a G1 country, which means it does whatever it wants to do without any serious consideration of a multilateral framework. They are not taking the regional organizations, for example, the European Union, seriously until 2003, 2004, simply because they still believe in this Westphalian concept of international diplomacy, the government-to-government relationship. They prefer to deal with for example, in the European Union relationship, they prefer to deal with Paris, London, and Bonn, or Berlin, but not put their trust in any multilateral framework. Okay. But since 2003, the European Union become the most important relationship, and it's on the top of the Chinese agenda, which means they are converted into a kind of diplomatic behavior which they're not used to in the past, and they are still in the learning process. Now, so in the case of Latin America, I think China is also dealing with the region in a multilateral framework, but without a regional organization. How can China pursue its objectives in this regional geopolitical setting? Now, I don't think China is ready, or China has a clearly defined strategy in dealing with the Latin American as a region. And so that could create a lot of problems in the future, especially if you look at Latin American local regional dynamics. There are many plans are in play, not necessarily materialized yet. There are many regional arrangement, including Chavez's favorite idea of oil cartel. All these regional dynamism are already in play. How China is going to deal with these potential development in the future? For example, will an American free trade area which including United States and Canada, will have a serious diversion effect in trade and in investment. And what would be the impact for a South American oil cartel on China's energy needs? So I think this is these are the real challenges, I think, for Chinese policymakers. And so far, I have not seen a serious efforts put in these the designs of meeting these potential challenges in the future. Now, the second point I want to mention is Latin America is politically relevant to China also until recently. Throughout the Cold War, Mao's fantasy is to promote revolution everywhere. And you see, the first Latin American study program in China was broadly defined as a national liberation movement as a subject. I believe Mao decided to create 3 programs: Beijing University, the Renmin University, and my own university in Fudan. The Fudan in Shanghai was unfortunate to have to accept a undesirable such subject of studying Western capitalism, but the national liberation movement in those days are the most fashionable subjects. In other words, Mao's thinking about Latin America is purely based on the idea how do you promote revolution in the Third World. But that era is over, and how Latin America can continue to be politically relevant to China. Now, my feeling is that for a very strange reason that Latin America become politically relevant to China through a regime which is not considered a desirable system in Latin America, that is Pinochet's Chile. I think Chinese elite began to pay enormous attention in the late 80s to so-called Pinochet model of political transition. Now, the reason for Chinese elite to look at Pinochet as a potential model, which may sound absurd today, but is that the Chinese economic reform create enormous tension within the system, that the one-party system found itself can no longer sustain the rapid development of the society and the economy. Okay. When Deng Xiaoping started economic reform, his philosophy is well known in China, so-called cat theory. Basically, Deng Xiaoping says, I don't care the cat is white or black, as long as it catches a mouse, then it's a good cat. Now, what Deng Xiaoping trying to say is, I don't care about ideology. I want to try everything. If that works to help the economic growth, that we will pursue that objective. Now, that's the foundation of the Chinese reform. The problem for that is that cat theory began to fire back on the one-party system itself. Because with economic success, the party is in a dilemma. It has to sustain continuous economic growth. If they, for whatever reason, if they cannot deliver in the next few years or at a certain period, but no one can sustain that rate of growth anyway. They knew that. So for whatever reason, if it cannot deliver, the cat theory will be reversed by the population against the system itself. That's to say, the popular view about Deng Xiaoping's cat theory is, if anything you cannot deliver, we might want to look for an alternative cat, which really means, I don't mean democracy, but at least the population are demanding a certain level of political pluralism, which put enormous pressure on the political elite. So this is why we have political tension in the late 80s, which eventually leading to Tiananmen Square. That is, how can we have a soft landing in our political system? Okay. In other words, what Chinese leadership hope is that we can find a working model that can help the system to start a orderly and peaceful transition from a authoritarian system to a more pluralistic system in the future. Okay. And that's still, I think, the political reform is still the main concern for the political elite. So this is the time Chinese elite began to pay attention to Latin American experience. And of course, there's also the relevance of economic development. But it's unfortunate that the early stage of Latin American economic success based on petrodollar or the debt-based economic growth turned out to be a disaster. Therefore, Latin American model become less and less relevant. And at the time, of course, in the 90s, then Chinese began to have this advantage of looking at the Latin American failure from the hindsight of their own successful implementation of a so-called Asian model of development, which is not based on concept of import substitution, not based on concept of borrowing. It's based on the concept of export-led economic growth. So I think the Latin American economic model is no longer attractive for the Chinese policy elite. So this is, I think, the main reason. I think besides the energies, we all know the energy demands, the trade demands, but there are also political reasons and international political reasons for China to pay attention to Latin America. But there are, in my view, there are two main foreign policy dilemmas for China in penetrating into Latin America at such a fast speed. One thing, economically speaking, I think China is very much in the Victorian England mindset. Now, that's the problem, I think. If you look at the trade pattern, as all experts noticed, China-Latin American trade is, especially China's import from Latin America, is based on a typical colonial products, very few products. Okay. It's dominated by these few products, the raw materials and energy sources, which of course is a kind of, whether you admit it or not, it is kind of colonial pattern. It's the model, as I said, is not the Spanish mercantile empire, but the model is the British free trade empire. But China has no empire. Now, how can you suck up the world resources without having an empire? That is going to be a main problem, I think. So far, I think Chinese solution is to base on building so-called soft power in Latin America. Especially the leadership developed this penchant, or developed this tendency in recent years of creating some overarching value-free foreign policy concepts, such as peaceful rise, we all heard about that, harmonious world. To use these concepts, try to explain to the world, to Latin America, that China's trade pattern is broadly within this framework of globalization trend. Therefore, it is not aimed at any third party. There is no geopolitical content in this economic relationship with Latin America. But China cannot, in my view, avoid geopolitical implications in pursuing a Victorian England trade policy. And another problem, I think my next speaker, the last speaker will talk more about, that is how China deal with the Monroe Doctrine. It is unfortunate. In many cases, Latin American events turning to the direction at the wrong moment for China. China like to have serious economic relations with Latin America when the Latin American politics turning left now. They used to support people like Chavez, Morales. They would be very happy to have a relationship with them, but precisely because the distinctive anti-Americanism represented by these left-wing leaders that pose a dilemma for Chinese, which they could not escape. The problem, whether or not China is helping the Latin American leaders to put to death of the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine, I think, is going to die in any case, but without China. But do you want to play a role in this? Latin American leaders want to get out of the Monroe Doctrine. China now want to get out the Westphalian system. So their objectives are not necessarily meeting each other in the geopolitical setting. So I think the Chinese leadership, I think, in my view, this is my conclusion, I think need to start several things. One is they need have a serious three-way dialogue, Latin America and United States, to make clear what China's intention is going to be. They should not hide behind these value-free foreign policy slogans, simply saying this has nothing to do with the United States. They cannot escape that consequences. The second thing, this is my view, China should utilize another potential partner in dealing with Latin America, that is Europe. My understanding is that the Spanish is very keen. Spanish, they proposed officially, and China accepted, to be some kind of bridge between Latin America and China. Now, the question is whether or not Latin America, needs the former colonial mother country to help. Latin Americans may think they can, penetrate China market by themselves. But the Latin American economy are not familiar with China market as the Europeans are. Okay. And the Spanish could play, in my view, or the European Union in general, could play a very important role. The Spanish government now is very aggressive, setting up Cervantes Institute, Spanish language training programs, and so on. This is, I think, is one safe approach for China to make its penetration into Latin America look like multilateral efforts rather than simply bilateral efforts. So my last sentence would be, Latin Americans facing challenge itself. Latin America needs to understand China. Latin America should not have too much expectation on China's Sino-dollar. You failed in utilizing the recycling petrodollar before, but now you seem to have a too high expectation for Sino-dollar recycling to help your budget problem, infrastructure problem. China is not going to, in my view, invest aggressively in the place where they have very little knowledge, that they don't understand local conditions. And also China, one of the problems of Chinese economic growth is the failure of the Chinese policymakers to understand the international monetary system. With $1 trillion assets, they are putting most of the money into the U.S. assets, which I think is a big mistake. But that will take a long time for China to really get used to the idea of direct foreign investment into the business, not just in the energy and the resource area. So there are a lot of problems on both sides that they need to learn from each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. That was a critique. Thank you. And now, Professor Li.
Okay,
Oops.
my topic is China-Taiwan rivalry in Latin America. Actually, the two flags makes very confusing in Latin America. I believe many people in Latin America could not tell which is the flag of PRC, which is the flag of ROC. In fact, I believe earlier this year, there's a celebration for a stadium in Grenada. And when that $40 billion stadium was completed, then a national song anthem was played, but not PRC, not Red China, not Communist China's national song was played, but Taiwan's national songs was played. It's a huge embarrassment for government of Grenada since they received $40 million to complete the project. So that's very confusing in many parts of the world. So today we try to figure out why, let me see, mainland China is so interested in Latin America. And so first, we're looking at economic goals of mainland China. Economically, China has three major goals. Secure raw materials it needed to diversify the sources in order to reduce the country's vulnerability. And there was mentioned by many scholars earlier, so I won't repeat that. The second, to maintain a high level of access to market. Latin American market is also very important for China. Just the figure presented by Professor Jiang shows that in 2006, the bilateral trade is $60 billion. It's a huge jump. Third, to gain recognition for full market status for China. China make a, let me see, a compromise when China admitted in WTO year 2001. That means China entered WTO not as a market economy. Therefore, other foreign countries or other sovereign government could sue Chinese government for dumping. So that's one objective for China to gain the so-called full market status for China. Therefore, Chinese goods and service could enter other market easier without, let me see, the competition. And political objectives, strengthen diplomatic relations. That's the main goal of the foreign policy. Of course, advance and protect Chinese national interests. The second, isolating Taiwan. And Taiwan is, let me say, interesting case in China. Since, especially since early 1990s, Li Dinghui, he became the president, the first Taiwanese-born president in Taiwan, and he launched a program to promote independent movement in Taiwan. So isolating China Taiwan has become main policy of China. And then we are looking at the importance of Latin American for Taiwan. Taiwan might have every attribute for independent or de facto country except for one thing, which is international recognition. Currently, there are 193 members of United Nations. Only 24 recognize Taiwan as sovereign state. Of these 24 countries, 50% in Latin America and the Caribbean. So Taiwan is crucial. Latin America is crucial for Taiwan. Taiwan has been devoting enormous efforts to retain the diplomatic recognition. And if the states switch this kind of diplomatic tie from Taipei to Beijing, there could be disaster for Taiwan. And there are several means to achieve the goals for both mainland China and Taiwan. First, looking at foreign aid. I just mentioned one example for Grenada. In year 2004, when Grenada tried to get more financial resources for economic program and asked for aid for both mainland China and Taipei, of course, PRC win the game. And the second, there's again year 2004 in Dominica. Both of them are very small island country in the Caribbean. It is said, according to Taiwan Times, and Taiwan offered $9 million, but mainland China offered $122 million in 5 or 6 years. And both of them are very small countries, so that 40 million or 120 million is a huge number for these two countries. And two-way trade. If you look at the figure in 1977, Taiwan trade figure is much larger than PRC trade. But if you look at the figure in recent years, and Taipei is well behind PRC. That's one of the reasons to explain why. Let me see. In 60s, PRC only have one diplomatic relation with Latin American country, which is Cuba. But nowadays, PRC have the diplomatic relation with most of the countries in Latin American. Trade play a very important role. Then I believe the recent year FTA free trade agreement play a crucial role for Taiwan to maintain the diplomatic relations with Central American and Caribbean countries. I was in Taipei year 2004 as a Fulbright scholar. So I talked with the people in Taiwan, both in government and academic, and I was talking about whether PRC will gain all the diplomatic relations in Central American and Caribbean. And Taiwan said no, because at that time, Taiwan completed a free trade agreement with Panama. So although PRC have more trade and China has become the second largest user of Panama Canal, but the goods and services produced in Panama could enter Taiwan freely. And Taiwan is one of the largest economy in the world. So PRC, as Professor Jiang indicated, that 2004, 2005, let me see, signed a free trade agreement. Another interesting case is Paraguay. Both mainland China and Taiwan tried to sign a free trade agreement with Paraguay. I believe if Brazil, Argentina, pressure more, since they are coming from the Mercosur, which is the Southern Caribbean market, that Paraguay might sign a free trade agreement with mainland China. So Taiwan might lose the last diplomatic ally in South America. At this moment, in Honduras, El Salvador are under negotiation with Taiwan to sign a free trade agreement. And Mexico is another very interesting case. Just Professor Jiang mentioned that maybe Mexico is not very interested to sign a free trade agreement with mainland China, but Taiwan definitely need to sign a free trade agreement with Mexico. Therefore, maybe in the long run, Mexico could, have more pro-Taiwan stance in international politics. Yesterday's Wall Street Journal presented, a recent figure for China's outward direct investment. In the past, China was mainly a recipient of foreign direct investment, but since year 2001, China has adopted an entirely different strategy, which is going global, not attracting foreign direct investment, but invest abroad. Latin America is considered as second largest destination of foreign investment abroad. But also, according to the Chinese figure, the largest recipient of Chinese investment, about the 16%, is Cayman Island and British Virgin Island. Not Brazil, not Mexico, not Argentina. Okay, so and tourism is also, a very interesting phenomenon. Maybe not in the United States, but in Europe, in many Asian countries, tourists from China has become an interesting phenomenon. And again, in recent years, Chinese government have designated several countries, especially several one in Caribbean, as the tourist destination that might help Chinese to win more diplomatic recognition in Caribbean. Maybe that's a bad news for Taiwan. And peacekeeping operation. Again, there's a change of Chinese strategy. In 1997, China vetoed UN Security Resolution to maintain a peacekeeping observer in Guatemala to end the civil war there. But right now, Chinese voluntarily sent peacekeeping operation in Haiti, which does not have diplomatic relation with mainland China. Yeah, it's a huge change. So China is playing maybe a more active and positive role in Latin America. Unlike in the 1960s and 70s, China, let me see, support the revolutionary movement, especially in Peru. That's the shining path, what people call Senderos. But it's no longer the case today. Now we're looking at the impact of Latin America. I believe Latin American countries will be happy to see the investment from Asian powers, from mainland China and Taiwan. Mainland China have more than $1 trillion in the central bank, and Taiwan have more than 200 billion. So they could play the game with, let me see, play both China and Taiwan. Again, as China turns into a growth engine, a number of countries are benefiting from tremendous economic development, are reluctant to make China angry. And politically, for years, Taiwan defined a free China. Mainland China was defined as a communist China, which support revolutionary movement, guerrillas, etc., etc. But China liberalized it economically and opened gradually politically, or liberalized gradually. The contrast is not as quite as sharp as before. Yeah. And impact for United States. Of course, there's a significant impact for United States since Latin America was regarded as a backyard of United States for a long period of time. But in general speaking, that Chinese investment in the region is about 8 billion, depending how you count that. In comparison with 300 billion for U.S. companies, it's just small potato. And the U.S. Latin American trade is 10 times greater than Sino-Latin American trade. But a growing influence, PRC could lead tension with the United States, giving Latin American countries in a region that many countries heavily depending on the United States. And the oil is a major thing, since China needs as much oil as possible. But we know that there's a limit for that. And recently, China tried to, to participate some of the agencies, organizations, which United States played a dominant role. And Taiwan was not very happy about that. I was in Taiwan in 2004. At that time, OAS passed a resolution allow mainland China to become observer. And Taiwanese were very angry about that. They considered that Washington could and should cast a veto. But for whatever reason, Washington failed to do that. But Beijing also worried about that. Beijing wants to be a member of Inter-American Development Bank. And Beijing worried that Washington favor Taiwan rather than mainland China, therefore did not cast a positive vote for mainland China to become a member of Inter-Development Bank. In conclusion, the struggle between Taiwan and mainland China for international recognition is likely to be intensified, especially before 2008, the year China will host the Olympic, and the year the current president, Chen Shui-bian, might declare political independence. So this year or next year could be very critical for the situation in Taiwan Strait. But Taiwan will compete, or has completed well with a smaller number of countries on the 8 program list. Taiwan is the 19th largest economy in the world, have $200 billion in central bank, but only have 24 countries on the list for recipient of foreign aid. So therefore, if you consider both mainland China and Taiwan played dollar diplomacy, maybe Taiwan could continue to play that very well, and also Taiwan could increase the number of free trade agreements in Central America and Caribbean. And for Taiwan, Latin America is crucial to the fact that about half the country Taiwan maintains the diplomatic relations are in Central America. For PRC, Latin America has become increasingly important, but it is still regarded as a region of relatively low priority for pursuit of grand strategy. I worked in China 20 years ago, and at that time, at a conference, when the important leaders were talking about Latin America, the people started to leave because that means that's the end of meeting. I assume that's the case today. Is that so, Professor Jiang? Probably, yeah. So, so for mainland China, Latin America is important, but it's still a low priority for China. And in the long run, China will continue to leverage economic clout in the region to support its political preference, pressing countries to fall in line on the top of foreign policy priority to isolate Taiwan. But in the long run, due to Chinese growing economic might and political influence, as well as the change of dynamics of Latin American domestic politics, it might become increasingly difficult for Taiwan to compete with mainland China. And that could be a good news for Latin American countries. China's growing influence in the region might compel Washington to pay greater attention to Latin America and Caribbean leaders when they complain about neglect from Washington. Okay, thank you very much. And again, I appreciate the invitation from Wilson Center and everything you have done to make that conference successful.
Thank you. Dr. Watson, I presume.
Thanks.
You needed that.
I needed that, that's right. Let me start out by saying that the remarks I'm about to make are entirely my own, not those of any agency of the U.S. government and not those of the National War College. Let me also extend my thanks to both the China and Latin American Studies programs here at the Wilson Center, and thank you again for the invitation. When one looks at U.S. relations with Latin America right now, one is struck by the fact that Latin America remains, yet again, the forgotten region. I would argue, and we could have a long debate about this, that there's actually a lot more attention being paid on Africa right now because of China than there probably is on Latin America. I just came back from a week in Bogota where the only discussion about the hemisphere was about bilateral U.S.-Colombian relations with a token bone thrown to the concerns about Venezuela. Nothing south of Colombia was discussed. I met with Colombian officials, I met with military officials, I met with U.S. government officials, and I met with people from the business sector. I found that to be absolutely staggering. And if one wonders why Latin America is a region that China might be involved in today, there's a very clear reason for it. The United States is focused exclusively on those parts of the world where they believe that there are terrorism possibilities. And I don't see that changing into the foreseeable future. At the same time, 2 weeks ago today, I had an hour meeting with the president of Taiwan in Taipei. And when I asked him directly what Taiwan was doing to enhance its own security by trying to increase the number of states with whom it had diplomatic relations, I got an answer that had nothing to do with anything outside of the island of Taiwan. It was a fascinating discussion for a country that does, in fact, have only 24 states around the world that recognize it. So of the 3 states that we're talking about today, with relations in Latin America somewhat forming a triangle vis-a-vis the rest of the region, there are 2 states, I would argue, of the 3 that aren't particularly paying attention to this region at all. At the same time, the 3rd state, which is the PRC, I would argue that China is is acting in an extremely calculated, very calibrated way, and will do nothing that will upset the current international process under which the Communist Party is staying in power. That process is defined as increasing the standard of living for the majority of people on a reasonably measured manner in China. And that remains the goal, and if that means that continued involvement in Latin America is important, they will do that. But if that means backing out of Latin America because you alert the United States to potential growth in Chinese investment and attention in this region, then they will back off from that as well. What I want to talk about is I want to talk about Chinese interests, which I'll go through very quickly because they've largely been said already. Then I'd like to talk a little bit more about the nature of the ties, what is Washington's response, and how does the global context fit in. Again, it's very clear that the relationship was one exclusively of PRC-Cuban relations prior to 1970. And I would remind everyone that the reason that the relationship changes from Chile, which I agree was the first state to recognize the Beijing regime in 1970, was because of the Allende government. It was not the Pinochet government that originally recognized China. It was Allende, and that seems to have been forgotten. Taiwan had diplomatic representation with this region for the prior 21 years, and the shift was a gradual one from 1970 to 1985. The current status is, and I will use the term, Beijing has most states. I'm somewhat amused by Professor Zhang's allusion to the fact that there are what he considered to be pseudo-diplomatic relations between Taiwan and the region, because if they're only pseudo-relations, I'm not sure why they bother Beijing so much. But the reality is that on the continent of Latin America, not the island states, but on the continent there are 7 states that represent an important relationship for Taiwan with nation states around the world. This is not an area that is a top concern for Beijing. As has already been discussed, the reality is that Africa is far more important for Beijing than is Latin America, but that is something that could change over the decades. What are the bases to these interests? Access to resources, energy, foodstuffs. We've already gone through all that in the prior panel and then as well in this one. Market access, the opportunities for joint partnerships to indeed oust Taiwan from its few allies, and continue seeking ties with states of the former Third World. I think that that last bullet is the one that the United States probably most misunderstands. We don't take words very seriously in this country, whether they're words that are said by the President, by the Vice President, by the Secretary of State, or by Congress. The reality is most of the rest of the world takes what they say very seriously. The idea that China would have a relationship with states based on the idea of non-intervention and multilateralism, hoping for multipolarity, is something that I think they take seriously. It does not mean that in a condition where they needed to back away from that, again, to keep the Communist Party in power through continued economic growth, that they wouldn't back away from it. But they do take this idea of third world solidarity somewhat seriously. This is a new phenomenon for Washington. We all, if you're a Latin Americanist, are aware of the fact that there have been challenges to the Monroe Doctrine or challenges to the United States in the Western Hemisphere. But there has not been a challenge, arguably, where you had a state that was in fact operating along a path of soft power. I thought the discussion and the last panel, and then again that Professor Zhang started with in this panel about the $10 billion was a most fascinating one. I think a lot of people wanted to hear $10 billion in investment, and with all due respect, I'm sorry, $100 billion, and with all due respect, I believe that is indeed what was said. But lots of things get said and then get changed, and there was a euphoria in 2004 when Hu Jintao made that trip to Santiago via Brazil, Argentina, and other places. There was nothing short of euphoria. At the same time, President Bush made one stop on the way back off the coast of Cartagena, and that was a much more low-key visit, one that had a lot less people power. That's a form of soft power. And it's something that the United States is not engaging in this region, but China is. There were and remain concerns about the Chinese connections to Cuba. My question would be, China, with its overwhelming sense of not liking instability, whether it's domestic or international, how likely is it that China will have very strong ties to Cuba in a period when Cuban politics are going to become unstable? I find that not particularly likely. I think there's concern about the Chinese involvement in Venezuela, but I think that that is more a function of concern about Chavez Frias than it is in fact about Chinese involvement. I think there's simply an unknown about him. And in an era when the United States at least seems to personalize foreign policy into one individual, pro or con, and we can find many examples of both, then that apprehension spreads to anyone with whom that individual is engaged. And I would argue that the most important relationship is not the one with Caracas, it's the one with Brazil, for the reasons that the first panel already talked about. I would also say that right now this city is consumed by concerns about Iraq and terrorism. Afghanistan is a subset of that, but anything beyond that is just not on the radar screen right now. We have forays into various parts of the world, but they're not sustained long-term involvements, or they're not attention getters that are reaching the highest level. They don't pass the front page of the Washington Post test right now. That's unfortunate, but Latin America is quite accustomed to that. It's been going on that way for a long time. Asia may not be accustomed to it. China in particular seems very uncomfortable when they don't believe that it's the first thing we think about in the morning and the last thing we think about at night, but the reality is right now what we're thinking about is Iraq and terrorism. Latin America is frustrated with the current lack of attention. Inattention is the term I used. I think that there was decided misunderstanding on both sides of the Rio Grande in 2000. The Bush administration thought that when you had a new president elected in Mexico who was not a PRI candidate, that meant you were going to have fundamental change in Latin America. Mexico is one place, and that was a president who basically had one agenda item that he had to pursue, and September 11th killed that item, namely immigration. On the other side of the border, there was a misunderstanding that a governor of Texas would fundamentally shift U.S. foreign policy to a Western Hemisphere orientation. Great idea, not likely to happen. If we personalize foreign policy, then we have to understand that in our own system, personalizing foreign policy into one new president makes it unlikely you're going to have structural change. Beijing has been gradually moving to solidify ties. We saw other presentations this afternoon that mention that, but they will do nothing, in fact, that will fundamentally alter the relationship with Washington, which is not only the most important relationship to Latin America, but is, in fact, the most important relationship for Beijing. And Beijing's investments, as we've discussed, have not turned out to be quite what was anticipated. I don't think Beijing would probably have acted as forcefully or as publicly in this region had Washington not been distracted, but I don't know. I can't prove that one way or the other. But I think it's a matter of a belief around the world as you see a China feeling much more confident that there are opportunities out there to take, and they are going to take those. I don't find that all that surprising. I tend to see states acting in their own interests, and China sees it's in its interest to try to diversify its relationships, as has been said earlier. I believe that Washington's interest in the region, in order to fundamentally cut back Beijing's involvement, if that's what we want to do, has to go beyond Colombia and whatever it is that the relationship's going to be with Venezuela, good, bad, or indifferent in the future. It's got to be a hemispheric-wide relationship, and I don't see that happening right now. President Bush is about to embark on a trip to the region. There's a lot of talk about it, but notice where he's going in the region. He's going to places that are relatively comfortable with the United States. If we believe in free trade, we ought to see Chinese competition as a good thing, because free trade talks about competition as being good. Yet, for all the talk about free trade, for all the talk about the WTO, that's not the way it's being conducted, or it's not being considered in that way. And I don't believe it has to be a zero-sum game. Let me talk just for a second about Taiwan. Taiwan is crucial for this region, Central America in particular, and it is crucial to Taiwan. But I think that there may be a misunderstanding both in Beijing as well as a misunderstanding in Taiwan about what role the United States would take, and these are, again, just my views, but what role the United States would take in changing anyone on diplomatic relations. That's not our job. And the United States respects the fact that states choose with whom they are going to have their diplomatic relations. Let me thank you again and end at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we have a little time. Just wait for the microphone, and if you have any questions. I think, let me just start off quickly, because I would like to ask Professor Chang. I want to get this accurate. You said China's overall view is to build a new order, a harmonious society, to fight against U.S. hegemonism. Would you elaborate on that, please? Or did you say that? And if so,
yes,
what?
Yes.
Oh, you said that.
Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
You said it. Okay. What did you mean?
Well, the U.S. Is the single superpower in the world, and it acts on its own will to bully other weak nations, even like China.
Don't mince words. Just tell us what you think.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's enough. Okay. In the back there, the lady, and just right there. Yeah. Just state your name and affiliation.
Roseanne Franco, PFC Energy. I was wondering if you could please comment on Beijing's view of Chavez's eagerness to diversify his oil exports to China. Thank you.
For me?
Yeah.
Well, there has been some trade of oil, but you have to understand that the oil produced in Venezuela is very heavy, and for China's oil refinery, it is it is quite difficult for China to process these kind of heavy oil. And secondly, you have to consider the geographical distance. It is so far away, so it is economically not very good to transport such kind of oil from Venezuela to China. But there is one oil refinery in Shandong province has the intention to buy a small amount of the kind of oil from Venezuela. And China has some investments in Venezuela, but they get the oil and just sell it on the world market.
Yes.
Just remember that Argentina and Brazil.
Wait for the mic, because I think we're being webcast, right? Yeah.
Just to remember that Argentina and Brazil exports more oil to China than Venezuela. And in terms of expanding the source of oil, I mean the project in Africa explains more than the interest in Latin America.
Yes.
That's a good point. In the back. Way in the back.
Claire Nelson. There are some people that believe that the Jamaican Chinese connection or the Caribbean Chinese connection, but with Jamaica being defined as an official tourist destination, that was just a mere, I would say, PR staging. And in fact, China plans to use Jamaica as like a launch pad for a quote unquote new invasion of Chinese into the Caribbean. As you well know, there was a migration from China to the British West Indies at the turn of the 19th century. So I'd just like your comments on what do you think the interest of this tourist destination that Jamaica supposedly is officially designated. What does it mean? Because nothing seems to have come of it. This is for Mr. Zhang.
Well, we have the...
I'm sorry, didn't Professor Lee bring up the topic?
Yeah, but he...
Okay. Well, believe it or not, he's Chinese too.
Yes, China has concluded the so-called tourist destination treaty with several, with many countries in Latin America, Europe, and even Africa. By saying that the tourist destination treaty, which means that both countries can offer visas in a quick way and all kinds of things. So some Chinese people are quite rich, so they can have the money to visit Jamaica, the Caribbean, and some other countries. So I think that will contribute to a better understanding between different peoples and different cultures.
Was that your question?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. This gentleman. No, you do. Yeah. It's webcast. Okay.
Well, thank you. My name is Hugo Cairuz. I work in the Embassy of Uruguay. In the 90s, I remember it was a book written by an American. There was a former chairman of the Hong Kong and China Council for Trade based on Hong Kong. And the title of the book was, in the 90s, China, the Next Economic Superpower. I think he calculated over 10, 20 years that China would become an economic superpower. And that is the reality now. If you see the WTO figures, China surpassed, Canada and now Japan, and is the third largest exporters in the world. If we see the figures in trading goods. But if we see the figures in trading services also, we see that China is one of the main exporters of services and also one of the most important importers of trading services. And in the case of Latin America, we listen in the first presentations, the importance for Latin America. I'm not very sure if it's the same in the case of China. I think Latin America in the 90s was less than 2% of Chinese export or imports. Maybe now it's better, but I don't think that is so much compared to the rest of Asia or the US or Europe. But I think it's very important for Latin America. In my opinion, I think that I see China more as an opportunity and not as a threat or challenge. In particular because to whom you will sell your raw materials if you don't sell to China now. So, taking this into account and this reality, in my opinion, I have two questions. First of all, you spoke a lot about the current situation. You made a very good analysis of the current situation. But my question would be to you, in your opinion, what are the best ways to increase and to improve the bilateral relations, between Latin America and China? In your opinion, what are the best ways to improve and to increase? And secondly, in the future of the bilateral relations between Latin American countries and China, what will be, in your opinion, the U.S. position? Thank you.
I'm sorry, who were you directing your question?
I think that everybody would like to.
Okay, well, about the monetary one, wasn't that you, Professor Xiang? No?
Well, I can answer that. First, maybe China could strengthen the study of Latin American studies. I came from China.
More money for Professor Xiang.
Yeah. 2 decades ago, there are more researchers, maybe double the size of researchers in Institute of Latin American Studies in Beijing. But right now, there's only 50% the staff remain there. In the past, there's 3 key universities have Center for Latin American Studies, but both of them, I believe one is, no longer exists. The other 2 are underfunded. I believe the director of Jiang can answer a question more. Maybe each year, China can only buy no more than 100 books in Spanish. Is that correct?
不好意思说.
Very little, the government support for Latin American studies. Therefore, it's hard for China to understand how to, sell more goods and improve cultural, political understanding of Latin American. Yeah, I believe, more study, more funding from government is a precondition if you want to improve the relations significantly.
And also, on your side, you also needed to know more about China. And so both sides should have more contacts and cooperations. Only by knowing better, so the boys and the girls can fall in love.
Why was the panda angry in the last slide?
I don't know.
That wasn't.
That cartoon was taken.
It looked like the
taken
macaw
from
bit the panda. And the panda.
Economist journal.
Okay.
Economist.
That was a strange slide. Ooh, lots of questions. We can say. I mean, we're over time, but what the heck? Yes, sir.
Actually, Mark, I've got it. Mark.
Yes.
I have only about 5 minutes. I need
all right.
to take off.
So, okay, if there are questions to Cynthia, because she's got to leave. But
okay, my name is Ralph Watkins. I'm with the U.S. International Trade Commission. I've got a question about the potential for Chinese investment in manufacturing in the Americas. Currently, Chinese-based companies are producing large screen televisions in Mexico. They're making yarn in Mexico. They're also producing major household appliances. Taiwanese companies are manufacturing fabric in knitting mills in Honduras. Is there what are the prospects for Chinese companies to establish manufacturing in the Americas to supply product for the American markets?
Go ahead.
Okay. I believe that China is followed the path of Japan. If you can look at Toyota, 20 years ago, Toyota is made in Japan. But right now, Toyota is made in the United States. Therefore, can avoid all kinds tariff and non-tariff protection from the United States. I believe that's a smart road to go. So the prospect maybe looks positive.
Any questions for Dr. Watson? Just for Dr. Watson, any? Going once, going twice?
Thanks, Mark.
You are dismissed, but
Thank you.
with thanks,
Thank you.
with our gratitude. Thank you very much. A little applause. Okay, let's go back to front. And there. Yes, yeah.
I'm Christian Perlmutter with Georgetown University. I'd like to direct this question to Professor Xian, Professor Jiang. And it's probably, I guess you would call a 比较敏感的问题. With the incredible investment that Beijing has been putting into the Olympics next year, including hiring Steven Spielberg to direct the opening ceremony, which I find very cool. You also have the question that Professor Li brought up, which is, during the Olympics, will Taiwan try to declare statehood? Taking into consideration the fact that the Communist Party must keep itself in power, and nationalism has been one of its main tools to keep itself in power, do you think that if Taiwan does indeed go ahead with this, do you think Beijing would, draw itself away from the Olympics and sacrifice the event to deal with the Taiwan issue?
It's a lot of speculation.
Well, just your, opinion.
I have no doubt at all they have to deal with Taiwan issue. That's I think a Taiwan issue is not something Chinese government can back off or back away if there is a declaration of independence or whatever big step toward that direction. I think that the only way to prevent this is to reestablish a kind of mechanism as Nixon-Kissinger time, so-called strategic ambiguity mechanism, which actually worked for 30 years until George Bush, who wanted strategic clarity. The Taiwan issue can never be a issue of clarity to begin with. So I don't see any alternative.
Let me just comment as someone who was living in Beijing in 1989. And unless we missed someone who knew the future, no one, including students in Beida and people on the street, and the embassies and the think tanks, no one thought that the Chinese government would use force against the students. They did, because they felt they had to. And I think the same principle would apply. That's my opinion. Professor Jeff.
Well, I think the Taiwan issue should be solved in any means. So you would walk away from the Olympics? Well, I don't think Taiwan dares to declare its independence in 2008 before 2000. I don't think there's the possibility.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we did a program last year. There's 1 million Taiwanese businessmen. 1 million out of a population of 24 million are living around Shanghai. I guess not noticed that much because there were so many people in Shanghai. But so that's a great pressure on the government. Plus, maybe in this respect, the U.S. government does do positive things, and to be blunt, we can also sit on them. And I think the pressures between, and I think most people in Taiwan, I think over the last, since Chen Shui-bian was elected, and people got excited in the beginning, but I think over time you see that the Taiwanese are getting much more, in my value judgment, much more responsible, and realizing that it's much better to be quiet and go about their de facto independence than to start getting up on soapboxes and screaming we're independent and risking disaster. Sir. Mike's coming. From your blind side.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks. I'm Dan Erickson with Inter-American Dialogue, and I've been told by some Chinese scholars who focus on Latin America before that a key area of study is how China can avoid ending up like Latin America. In other words, or avoid the Latin American the Latin Americanization of China, where you have basically countries that aren't that competitive, that aren't able to really compete successfully in the global marketplace. And I was curious to know from your perspective, have focused on these development issues, when you look at Latin America today, is there anything that you see that's appealing about the Latin American economic or social model? Are there areas of Latin America that China would like to emulate? And conversely, are there areas that you see Latin America heading where China is anxious to avoid? Thank you.
Well, I don't know if you can read Chinese or not. I have published a lot on this topic, so-called Latin Americanization, and as far as I know, there are 4 terminologies. One is Latin Americanization. Secondly, it's called Latin American disease. Third, it's called Latin American phenomenon. Fourth, called Latin American trap. You will fall into the trap. And I published a lot saying that these 4 terminologies are wrong. You can say Latin Americanization, but you have to offer a clear definition. And I have calculated there are more than 20 different definitions. There are soybean. There are Latin Americanization of soybean, Latin Americanization of soccer, Latin Americanization of unequal income distribution, crimes, environment, all kinds of things. So everything bad is called Latin American disease or Latin Americanization. And in one of my papers, I said that China even has some difficulties, problems. Can we say China disease? Can we say Chineseization? No, that's not correct. So my personal view is that by saying one of these 4 terminologies, we should have a clear definition. And most of the Chinese scholars believe that that definition means unequal income distribution. And by saying that, China should learn the lesson from Latin America. China's Gini coefficient is 0.45. It's quite high. Okay. And I have a project which is called the Future Prospects of Latin American Development. So what will be like for the region of Latin America? Politically, the left will wage revolution. Every country will be governed by the left-wing politicians. There will be financial crisis. social problems will become worse and worse, and foreign policy, so there will be a fight between the U.S. And South America. There are some Chinese people believe that. And my personal view is that no, politically, there will be, on the whole, there will be more political stability on the whole. Economy will growing fast. There will be less and less financial crisis. But social problems will be harder to be resolved. And foreign policy, so Latin America will continue to pursue its so-called diversified foreign diplomacy. The U.S. relations with Latin America will be good on the whole, although sometimes there will be problems. So my project is to study the future of Latin America. So personally, my hope is quite promising for Latin America. And as your question, your second part of your question, what can China learn? Are there any nice things of Latin America China can learn? Well, so Latin America can consume. Chinese people, influenced by the Confucius tradition, try to save. So our domestic demand cannot be stimulated. So this is one point, I think. And secondly, so Latin American people are quite active in culture or in thinking. Some of the Chinese people are quite concerned. So I'm not sure if this is the point.
The culture.
In terms of culture. And the third,
the Communist Party could loosen up a little and do a little dancing and stuff. Music, salsa, that would be good.
Yeah. And the third, I would say, China should learn from Chile or other countries to reform the so-called social security system.
Oh yeah.
And or if we had time, we can calculate more. So every nation, every people has its own strong points. So China can learn many things from Latin America. So Professor Li will add more, I think. So
yeah, when I was in China, in the institute with Professor Jiang, we studied a lot about how Latin America introduce foreign technology, how Latin America attract foreign direct investment, how Latin America, industrialized in the 1930s, and how import substitution industrialization became a failure, how China could avoid this kind of trap. Yes, China did gain a lot from the experience of Latin America, because China considered Latin America was the middle class of developing countries. Although Latin America is a part of the Third World, but in terms of social economic development, Latin America is well ahead of those in many of South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, etc., etc. Yeah.
Okay, I think on that note, as Jay Leno might say, you've been a great audience. It's getting late. If you have questions, I'm sure if you want to come up, don't be shy. The remaining panel will stay to answer your questions. Thank you very much for coming.
We'll stay here till midnight.
You will.
Yeah. 今天你回去吗？
明天回去。
明天回去啊。
Oh, yes.
No. And if you want to go tomorrow to Capitol Hill,
No. I'm
you
with
believe
Henry Stimson.
America is a bully.
For 3 weeks.
You may do that, but you're going to get your head taken off. So, but that's okay. I will support you. I will support you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, sure. Yes. Do you have a car? I do have a car. Yes. But I didn't. I just arrived, so I haven't. I forgot my own telephone in my office. So the only thing I have is a Geneva card with my email.
I can send you an email.
Right.
Just to organize
a
dinner.
Sure.
Dinner.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much. And which department?
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
我的名字比较奇怪。
Doing a workshop for society.
我这个姓是比较名字也很奇怪。
是，谢谢啊。
您哪里？台湾可是？对啊。
Hello.
Hi.
It's my card.
Oh, okay.
That's my email address.
So you have a nice Chinese name.
Thank you. I have one specific request. You PBS.
It's over there. Please. Very important. Yes, please.
Europe together can change the modes of world affairs or something.
Well, how can I? But I need a. Can you?